Okay. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for joining us live for the first in the mission-driven or Mission Impossible virtual roundtable series, featuring industry-leading agri-food tech, climate tech, CEOs and C-suite executives, really discussing the nuts and bolts of the common startup challenges and sharing their strategies for success. Now, navigation around communication, the communications landscape, is really one of those challenging issues and challenges, I suppose, for early stage companies, with many CEOs learning the skills of leading a business on the job for the first time. And for our first webinar is all around agri-food tech, climate tech bombs. So it's building the buzz, creating the buzz, surviving the buzz. And we've got an amazing high-profile panel that really packs a punch today. So introducing in the red corner, Rachel Konrad, Chief Brand Officer of the Production Board, who are a mission-driven VC firm founded by David Freeberg. Now, having led communications at Tesla and Impossible Food, Rachel advises and guides a number of passionate, mission-driven companies as a board member and advisor, driven by her #1 passion, which is all about decarbonizing the world. Rachel, thanks for giving up your time. I know you're off around the world putting events on and working with hundreds of companies. So listen, I don't take your time lightly. Thanks very much.
Thank you. This is super important, and really happy to be invited in this illustrious panel of guests. It's going to be great. I'm looking forward to learning a lot.
No, great. And Charlie Dimmler, CEO and co-founder of Checkerspot, from a materials innovation company using fermented microalgae to produce performance-led materials that are less toxic and safer for the environment. Checkerspot have launched an outdoor recreation brand called Wonder Alpine, really as a marquee demonstration of their innovation capabilities. And but Charlie is a real strong believer that business can be a force for good, I suppose, especially when it comes to managing our finite natural resources. So, so Charlie, I'm just thinking back to all those COVID conversations we had with that long beard. I haven't seen you for a while, so it's great to see you. How's things? All right?
Everything is great. It's fantastic to be here. Good to see everybody.
Excellent, excellent. And last but by no means least, Irina, Gerry, Chief Marketing Officer of Change Foods, a company creating animal-free dairy foods, starting with cheese, right? But by leveraging precision fermentation. Now, Irina led the high-growth plant-based categories whilst at White Wave and Dimmler. So, you know, really got an upfront seat years ago in the kind of the growth of the plant-based sector, and is a purpose-driven entrepreneur on a mission to transform the food system and drive the widespread adoption of sustainable ways to feed the world. So Irina, thanks. I know, again, busy around the world, traveling, lots of things going on with Change Foods, and, you know, so really appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So, yes, we've come up and we've discussed a number of topics. I think maybe starting with just giving some thoughts to, you know, like communications on a bootstrapped budget. And, you know, like seed stage Series A companies are really stuck between that rock and a hard place. I suppose when it comes to funds and it comes to the allocation of capital. And, you know, communications, companies don't tend to have the budget for communications, dedicated communications people and a plan. And sometimes, you know, without that attention to detail when it comes to, I suppose, communicating their message, you know, they miss out on investment, partnership, and growth opportunities. You know, I suppose if I think about this and I think about who are we communicating to? Who are the main, you know, who are the main audiences, do you think, across this complex value chain? Maybe we'll start with Rachel.
Yeah, so one of the first things I do whenever I help an early stage company CEO, by the way, they never have staff for marketing and communications, nor should they. It's actually an irresponsible use of their investment, right? I mean, I don't think Vinod Khosla or Bill Gates or Seed to Growth or any Temasek, they don't invest in a company like Impossible or Tesla or whatever in order to hire a bunch of marketers, right, to do golf sponsorships and everything. So right from the get-go, you have to do things scrappy and cheap with communications. And usually at the seed series A, B, even C, right, they really have to rely on the CEO's communications abilities. And that means the CEO, whether or not he or she is an engineer or a doctor or anything, has to become a comms expert, right? And they've got to do it pretty fast. So I do, consulting. I know a lot of people who do. In fact, the production board was founded, in part to solve this problem so that, you get my expertise, right, if you're in the portfolio, right? And there are a lot of venture capital companies that are adopting this model so that you don't have to do it on your own, so that you have a team, it's a fractional team, right? But it's a team to do it. And at that point, I usually come in and I talk to the CEO directly, and we have to do two things right up front. Number one, we have to create the brand identity of the company. What is the mission? What is the problem? And what is your solution, right? You would actually be shocked at the number of companies that can't articulate that. So we flesh it out in very simple words very quickly. And then the number two thing I talk about is who are your key stakeholders? Who is your audience? And inevitably, the CEO always says, it's everyone. We want 100% awareness. And nope, that's not an option. You have to give me your top 2 or 3 max stakeholder groups. And usually for very early stage startups, it is some combination of investors. In the food tech space, it's often policymakers, right? If there's a GMO or some regulatory issue you have to get over. And 3 might be media or thought leaders or food media, or, think about, ag funder or, some trade publications or something like that. And those are the only 3 people we're going to communicate to, right? And so you have to really focus. That's kind of my startup plan right there.
Great. Okay, so no customers there at all in the startup plan.
If it's a very early stage company, you often don't need it, right? If you don't even have proof of concept yet, and you're just kind of bearing out the technology, you might not need it. That might not come till Series B or C, right? It might start, right? You might want to create, like I call it industry comms. Like we might want to pick 2 conferences that you're going to go to over the next year. It might be the NRA, National Restaurant Association conference, although that you got to be very close to having a product that's commercially available. Or it might be SynBio Beta, right? The big conference in Oakland every year. If you're really, really early and if you're looking for recruitment. The other opportunities, by the way, it's up to the CEO to decide. The other stakeholder groups, it might be scientists, it might be employees, right? You want to recruit employees. It might be, politicians, not just policymakers in the FDA, but it might be politicians. If you're a fusion company, right, you might need to really target policymakers in your hometown where you're about to build a reactor, right? And so it really just depends on the company, but it's usually some combination of investors, regulators, policymakers, politicians, customers, media, maybe in some very rare cases, it's influencers or celebrities. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And Charlie, how different for you in your business? I'm thinking, like when it comes to either policymakers or you've got a consumer brand as well. So yeah, how are you thinking about this?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, first of all, everything that Rachel just voiced resonates really deeply. And I think what I would add is that it's really important to understand the audience that you're engaging with, and to meet the audience where the audience happens to be. And as Rachel pointed out, it can be very tempting to avoid prioritizing who, as a CEO or as a founder, you want to reach first. But inevitably, even if you've gone through the process of going through that prioritization and having that plan and that focus, you're inevitably going to engage with people that fall outside of that core focal area. And what I think is important as part of communicating is listening and really, you know, being curious and asking questions and exploring, again, in the vein or in the spirit of meeting people where they are. What's important to that stakeholder? What's keeping them up at night? What matters most? And then thinking about how, in our case, what CheckerSpot is doing can potentially solve a pain point or create value, deliver something that is important and of interest to that particular stakeholder. And I think that there's a lot of trial and error. There's a lot of, you know, having these conversations and taking on board learnings, like really leaning into that curiosity. And over time, the more conversations that I can look back and reflect on, the more it's helped to hone not only the message and how something is communicated, but fundamentally the problem that we're solving for that particular stakeholder, whether it's investors or, you know, potential members of the team or policymakers or customers or partners. And in our business, it even gets more complex because we're in different markets where those things continually change. It's not the same across the board. And so the final point that I would make is that I would argue that the hardest thing is really crystallizing as simply as possible what it is that you stand for, what, like, the core value of the company, the mission, the vision. And I feel that that's often glossed over, that's viewed as something that's easy. And I don't think it's an overstatement to say that it's something that we agonized over in the very early days of CheckerSpot. I mean, thousands of hours of, you know, testing, kicking around. Do we want to evolve it? Do we want to change it? And even to this day, 7 years in, you know, we still ask that question. You know, is there any need to evolve it, to change it? And I think that's critical to know who you are as you're engaging with whatever stakeholders.
Charlie and team have done a really great job. I worked a lot with them in the early days, and I can vouch for the agonizing. He spent a lot of time personally, and that's exactly the kind of thoughtful approach you need. And if you do it well, you don't need to sponsor golf championships and tennis tournaments, right? Like, the mission matters most. But you would be really shocked, Simon, at the number of companies that really don't think about it, or they take for granted that everyone understands their mission and they don't need to articulate it, right? I mean, Charlie and team did a great job on that.
And a great
Irina. I think I would layer on, you know, this idea that, oh, you don't need marketing early on. I actually would disagree with that, but I would redefine and kind of broaden the idea of marketing. I think many people think of marketing as sales, right? They think of the final end of the funnel where I just want to get in front of a consumer and sell them something, right? And that's where you go to sponsoring golf tournaments and running 30-second TV spots. That is a tiny sliver of, in my mind, in my universe, what marketing is, right? Marketing starts with, what is your idea? What's your why? And who are you talking to? So a lot of what Rachel said is, in my view, marketing, right? Like, when you're first starting a company, it's not about the what, it's about the why, right? It's the mission. It's what problem are you trying to solve in the world, which I think is most critical. And sometimes in a lot of technology companies, when they don't have marketers on board early, whether it's through contract or in-house, they're so focused on the what, the widget, that they forget the why, right? They forget to say, well, why are we existing? Whose problem are we solving? And those are critical questions to answer internally and externally as well. Minding your audience, of course, you're talking to investors, you're talking to collaborators, you're recruiting your talent, right? But I think the why is really important early on. The who is critically important. So again, we like to think about product, but when you are in early stages, you're selling the vision and you're selling the team more than you're selling anything else. So being able to say who and why are these people important and what are their personal missions, what are their messages is absolutely critical to getting that early stage traction. And so understanding, is it just the CEO? Do you have other people on the team who play parts in the story of, you know, who is behind this, right? And then you have the how, right? What is it that we're doing and kind of what the mechanics of it, and then the what comes last, right? So I think I'm just layering on an additional component to this, who your audience is, but also where do you place emphasis at different points in your communication and the journey of the company.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems I'm looking at some of the press and some of the comms out there. Things have become a lot more kind of political in terms of engaging politicians, you know, bringing them on board, you know, when it comes to the decarbonisation journey. I mean, is that something you've seen change more recently, and do you have to adjust your comms to take that into consideration?
I mean, I'm happy to talk about that one. You know, we saw this quite clearly at Impossible Foods. I mean, I joined Impossible Foods in 2016, right at the beginning of the, you know, Trump era, right? And that the United States in particular has been increasingly polarized, right, for, you know, a decade or more. Social media definitely plays a role in that. But it became really an accelerated trend in 2016, right? And Trump fundamentally changed a lot of the, you know, rhetoric that people use to identify themselves. And we really had to think quite a bit about that, right? In the very beginning, it almost, you know, didn't matter what our political stance was. We had a very expensive, you know, product, the Impossible Burger, that was literally handmade by PhD biochemists in Redwood City, California. It was always going to start out as the $25 bistro burger for coastal elites in New York and LA, right? That's sort of the definition of how you start your company. You have a premium product and you want to make it more, bring down the price and make it more and more mass market mainstream. And if that's your starting point, then you kind of know who your audience is, right? And you go for them. And, you know, you do have to give them some of the signaling that politicians would use as well, right? But then as you cross the chasm and you work on your own cogs, right, and you get that price point down, then the messaging can certainly change to be much more encompassing. I don't work for Impossible Foods. I am not a company spokesperson, but you could see just this week they launched at the International House of Pancakes with their sausage product. It's very low price. The company is really, really doing mainstream mass marketing at this point, and they've really evolved, right? But now they're, you know, whatever series E, F, G, H, I can't even remember. It's very, very late stage, right? And so your messaging has to evolve. But I think it would be really ludicrous, honestly, for a startup that knows that under any circumstance, it's going to launch with a premium product that's 2-3x the price of the incumbent version, to take on a messaging that is a big tent, we're for everyone. You're not. You still have a crazy expensive product. It would be like when we launched the Tesla Roadster in 2008, it was a $150,000 sports car. It was a toy for rich environmentalists. Let's be really honest, right? We had a clear path about what how the next car was going to be half that price, and the next one was going to be $50,000. And Tesla has definitely achieved that. And you know, the TAM, the total, you know, volume that they're hitting, the coverage market has commensurately grown. Right now, the price of the Model 3 is exactly the same as the average price of a new vehicle in the United States. So obviously Elon is not just marketing his product to, you know, rich Silicon Valley, you know, influencers, and the messaging changes. You have to Charlie's point, you have to continue to evaluate not so much your mission, but how you talk about it as your customer journey evolves.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Completely agree. Yeah, I see that a lot in early stage companies where they're trying to be all things to all people. I'm like, that is the worst thing you can be. And I know sometimes investors perhaps push that inadvertently where they say, well, what is your big pie, right? Like, where's the end vision? Let's go there and be there. I'm like, you're not ready, right? You have to start at the bullseye and grow exponentially over time. And you could not, if you start an early stage company, especially the one that is disruptive of the category, you're not mass market. You won't be mass market for years, right? If not decades. And marketing as though you're mass market, I think is a really big mistake, because then you don't catch the early adopters.
Yeah, they're great. Thank you. Moving on to internal comms, and this is something, Rachel, when we had our podcast discussion a few months ago, I know this was a really big one. It really got me kind of thinking around, there's always so much focus on external comms for startups or growth companies, getting the message out there that they sometimes ignore that whole internal kind of comms piece as the company grow. And, you know, there's nothing, you know, nothing more difficult as a company grows, more people come in, things get diluted along the way, and then people are hearing about things out there in the press before they've been communicated with. So how does startups and scale-up companies align internal and external communication needs, you know, and what priorities are given to the internal comms? Charlie, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the number one priority, frankly, because if you're not building and fostering an environment, a team, a culture that is working well together, then it makes it exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to achieve any kind of big ambition. And I don't think it can be overstated that it's pretty much impossible to over communicate. And I think more often than not, at least in our experience, we've identified opportunities to do more communication where we thought we had communicated enough, where in fact we clearly hadn't. And to be humble and to be open about that, and then to really make adjustments to compensate in the situations in the event that we haven't communicated sufficiently. I think, Simon, you mentioned something a moment ago that is really important, which is that sure, you have designated individuals on the team that are, you know, spokespeople for external communications, yet every single person within the community, and the community is defined not only as, you know, members of the team and employees, but also partners, customers, investors. There's a whole range of stakeholders that become, you know, ambassadors that are communicating, for better or worse, what the company is doing. And I think that the takeaway is that the message has to be able to survive, you know, the old quintessential telephone game. And it has to be as simple and high fidelity as possible. And unfortunately, I think in our space, in our part of the world, we're so enthusiastic, we're so excited about the virtue of the technology itself, you know, that we want to talk about, you know, synthetic biology, industrial biomanufacturing, you know, the biotechnology, like to get into the molecular biology or the material science. And the reality is that most people, you know, aren't thinking in those terms. They don't have that lens on the world. And so it really has to be simple. And that's one of the reasons that strategically we elected to enter into the market in a category and with some applications that would allow us to bring to life and to show what we mean by materials that make better consumer products. And to have it be something that an individual could experience, and then they could then pass on to their friends and family in a really simple, again, high fidelity fashion.
Yeah, no, great. And I'm thinking, like, does it feel like this communication, the internal plan and the structure of how you communicate internally and the cadence, that feels to me like that's a real driver and creator of culture, company culture. That's what it's really like to work at this company. This is how they operate, as it were.
Repetition.
Yeah, repetition, consistency, and engagement, I would have thought, internally. Irina, would you agree with that?
You know, I don't think culture is such a nebulous thing. It's certainly not shaped by your mission, and it's not something that you put on a wall. I think to me, culture is shaped by everyday interactions. It's not even about communications as we would put in a formal sense. In fact, I think most startups don't have a formal communication plan, right? Like Rachel said, you can't hire an internal, forget communications, you don't even have an HR person, right? As you're starting out, like it's the founder and the co-founder wearing a million hats. And where I see the transition is when it's early, everybody's kind of running on a mission, right? Like you're very kind of, your early team does everything all the time, and there's a really tight ring of communication, so you don't really need a plan. But then as you start to grow and you hire people and they're coming in more as employees, yes, they might have shares, but it's not as big of shares, and then you're hiring specialists and you start to grow your team, you kind of need to continually, slowly formalize your communication plan. So I think when you first start, it's nothing. Everyone's in the same room and knows everything, you don't need to say. Then you start to have people that are, separated in time and space, and then you need more communication. And as you grow, you need more and more formal communication, and you're obviously evolving your policies or developing your policies. And, the other piece to a startup life is the plan is always changing, right? You might have your mission and your bigger vision, but how you get there is a crazy roller coaster of many turns. And what I find to be most important is that that's what gets communicated, right? Yes, everybody kind of gets and understands the bigger mission, but what are we doing when, and where does each individual team member contributing the most, and how they feel most valued and most kind of part of the process, even though it's constantly changing. That's where I think what drives, the communication piece, and that's what creates culture. Culture to me is how, you feel as being part of the team, part of the mission, part of the organization. It's not about, I get a weekly or monthly newsletter, and, that to me is all noise.
Yeah, so what do people want to see then? What really engages kind of employees, internally? What's the best way of engaging? What practical steps do you need to put in place around that?
I'm happy to take a whack at this one. Simon knows I'm all about very practical advice, because I hope that there are a lot of sort of mission-driven founders and C-suite execs who listen to this and want something to take away. I would say, so I was employee number 100 or so, right, about 100 at Tesla and 150 roughly at Impossible Foods. And now in my role at the production board, I work with very early stage companies that are, literally just a founder and one or two business people and scientists and stuff like that. And I will say this, in the very beginning, probably for the first few years, right, it really all falls on the CEO and founder, right? And as Irina mentioned, I can't emphasize that enough. You do not have the budget to hire even an intern to do your internal comms. And by the way, if you did, it would feel kind of chintzy and outsourced. So you need to do this yourself. And for those first few years, as your company grows, it's literally you, founder, CEO, on the desk talking to all of your team, right? And I often hear of CEOs at early stage founders, startups, who they'll do like a once a month all hands. And I'm like, whoa, you need to do this once a week at minimum, right? And you need to stand up on your desk whenever you need it. You need to constantly reiterate the mission. You need to constantly reiterate the evolving, pivoting plan that you have, customer wins, customer potential, investment wins, all of that. You got to bring everyone to the table, right? But there's something that really interestingly happens at around employee 150, and that is very, very key. There's been a lot of studies about this, a lot of science on it. We humans evolved to be maximum in groups of about 150 people, wandering in the savannah or whatever. And it's very hard for people to keep in their minds more than about 150 names and faces, right? And so you can, in your brain, in human brains, even This study has been done on extreme extroverts, on introverts, et cetera. There are people, you know, like Bill Clinton famously could just keep everyone in his mind, right? But most of us, it's about 150 people. So once you hit 150 people, you really have to change your internal communication strategy. And at that point, you know, as Irina mentioned, at that point, it is very much more like running a small media empire, right? Where you need multiple channels of communication. The CEO still needs to stand on the desk. They still need to do the weekly all hands. But then you might need a newsletter. You might have people working in Chicago or London or Singapore, or you might have scientists and manufacturers working in a different division, you know, different building. You might, in Charlie's case, start branching out. Now you have different brands. You have a team in Salt Lake City doing skiing, you know, equipment. You have the core team in you know, East Bay working on R&D, right? So you actually need to cater to multiple people. And that is about the time when you need to not necessarily hire someone, but you need to have someone, whether they're in communications or HR or whatever, there's a lot of decisions you can make, but you need to have someone who's thinking pretty consistently about this to get the message out. Before that, when you're a really scrappy series seed A, B company, it is really does fall on the CEO. But after that, at around employee 150, you actually have to be very conscious that you now run a small empire, and your communications have to look like that of a, you know, town of 150 or 200 people in the middle of Kansas, right? Where you have the loudspeaker, you also have weekly meetings, you might have an email blast, you might use Nextdoor, whatever, right? But it's exactly the same method.
Yeah, great. Charlie, how many people at Checker Spot at the moment?
We're coming up to 100 people.
Can you get 100 names now? Could you name them off?
Yeah. I mean, we've had a few people that have joined in the last 2 weeks, and so there's still one or two folks that I haven't met in person, but yeah, everybody at the company I know.
Yeah, no, great. And when did you notice, like, you know, like Rachel mentioned 150 is that critical kind of mass, that number. But, you know, from a growth viewpoint of starting with a handful of the founding team, when did things have to evolve? When did you have to start changing and being more mindful of messaging?
I think for us, first of all, Rachel is right in terms of the literature and the data. For us, it came a bit earlier, I think primarily because of the two different geographies. And to answer the question, it was probably at around 50 to 70 people. We really started to discover we needed to do more in terms of communication and in terms of communicating plans. And I think that theme of finding different medium to connect with people is enormously important. The repetition is really important. And also, you know, kind of coming back to one of the themes that I tried to voice earlier in meeting people where they are, that like take for instance all of our inboxes. Like we're drowning in email. You know, we now have multiple forms of digital communication, whether it's, you know, Slack or instant messaging of whatever form and variety, email, like shared documents, you know, intranets. There are all of these forms of ways to communicate, and everybody is trying to compete for mind share, for attention. And we're also doing this at a time when we're still in a mode of recovering from the pandemic, where, you know, there was isolation and people were working in remote locations. And I think for us, what we found is that in-person engagement is just an amplifier in the connectivity, and it's in the ways that people communicate informally. I think one of the points that Irina made before in terms of, you know, culture is not defined by, you know, the thing that you put up on the wall. It's not about, you know, the newsletter that, you know, maybe some people read, others don't. It's about the conversation that happens by the quintessential water cooler and in the kitchen, and, you know, when the meeting adjourns and everybody is like pulling their stuff together, the conversation that happens. Like those are moments where I think culture is really solidified. Those are moments when there's a different level of communication and focus. And are critically important.
That's great.
Just one point, I think the 150 research, I've seen it too, and it's very true when you're all co-located and what Charlie's bringing up, but I'm seeing this to be an issue much earlier on, because now with COVID and remote work and multiple locations, I mean, we're in an industry where you go where your resources are. We don't have the luxury of co-locating everybody in one place anymore. And, you know, Change Foods is 25 people and we're operating on 3 continents. It is crazy. It creates a huge set of challenges for communication, and not communication in a formal sense, but in a sense of people understanding and being in touch. And, you know, then you need a plan. You can't wait until you're 150 because you won't make it to 150. So I would say it's stage and location dependent. And the second you have remote folks, you got to make a plan right away.
Yeah, great. Irina, I just wanted to ask you, because, you know, you came from, you know, the White Wave and Danone, you know, interchange. And, you know, what I love about what Change do, the comms and the profile you've built, it's been built on very honest, factual communications. And you've really built a kind of gathering of people that, you know, look out for your stuff and, you know, read it pretty intently. And I'm just wondering, you know, we speak about startup budgets and then coming from Danone, and must have been very different. So just, yeah, like how, you know, how, I suppose the question is, like, it must have been such a different environment to operate in. Like, just give us a sense on the challenges or the real difference between coming from a corporate to you know, an innovating startup, as it were, that's starting it.
I mean, it's night and day, right? So I worked at big companies like Procter and Gamble and, you know, White Wave and then Danone, which, you know, it's like as big a corporate machine as you could think of with, you know, and from a marketing, I was in a marketing function, but my job is almost unrecognizably different because, yes, the title may have stayed similar, but in reality, what you do as a startup, the resources you have, the structures you have, the roles you have is night and day, right? And so it's, for me, it's been about understanding, again, going back to who you're talking to, what are you saying, where do you place your emphasis? And I am 100% believer in early stage companies are all about the mission, they're all about the people, they're all about the founder. And I think authenticity is absolutely critical because, again, you're marketing to investors, you're marketing to early employees, you're marketing to partners. They need to see, understand, and believe in who you are and what you're trying to achieve in the world. And you could not hide behind science, you could not hide behind technology, you don't have product and market. It's all about authentically being in the world and communicating loud and proud and clear of who you are and what you believe, because that's what people want to come and build with you. So that to us has been, I mean, it is an authentic, so like if you don't really have a mission, you don't really have a vision, you can't communicate it, right? So you need to start with having one and making sure you can articulate it. But I find it to be the most powerful tool, more powerful than honestly paid media. Because in today and age world, broadcasting at people through just, you know, shouting down messages does not work. Nobody cares. Everybody tunes it out, right? The days of 30-second TV spot are over. It's about people wanting to engage with people and wanting to believe in what you're trying to do in the world. And to me, that's where, you know, if you look at kind of how we communicate and how we market, it's 100% about people. And it's about that authentic connection. It's not about, look at the product we're trying to sell.
Yeah. And Charlie, just back to the point with when you think about Checkerspot and you think about, I suppose, the challenges that companies have had in the B2B space, whether it be materials, whether it be chemicals, and engaging the brand owner. So, you know, you thought very much about kind of how do we get that brand, how do we market a brand, right? How do we get a brand with value out there? Tell me, there's a lot of chat about B2B2C. How useful is that now when it comes to growing, developing, and scaling the business now, would you say?
The first thing that I think is important to say is that this probably is the most significant communications challenge that we've grappled with in CheckerSpot's history, which is that various stakeholders will see what we're doing and see Wonder Alpine and view CheckerSpot as a consumer company. And that was never part of the mission and the vision. Like, the only way that we're going to have impact in the world is through B2B engagement. And we've always described our consumer business as an extension of the laboratory, as a way to bring to life, to animate what's possible with the fundamental materials and the ingredients that we're developing, that are proprietary, that are differentiated. It's a way to de-risk the adoption of those materials by large incumbent companies that have the distribution and the reach to bring the materials to market. But we know from history that often the largest companies are the ones that are the most risk averse, that are the most cautious in adopting new technologies. And so for us to bring something to life and to fundamentally de-risk it through consumer engagement was strategic as a way to bring forward the demand curve. And that's in fact what's happened. And now, as we're selling into the outdoor recreation market and the portfolio of customers is growing, and the relative contribution of revenue between B2B and B2C is shifting, that's really coming to life. But there was a lot of effort, time, and energy. And I would argue, stakeholders that just couldn't wrap their head around it, that we didn't continue to work with in some fashion. It's one of the most significant communications challenges that we've grappled with.
Yeah, and tell me, do the B2B clients that you're working with, are you able to present more value through the brand and the company through what you've done with Wonder Alpine?
Yeah, without question. I think it wasn't part of our original vision to have access to the factories and to have access to applications development at various brands that we're engaging with. But one of the things that we found is that as we've gone through the qualification process with different customers, that it's enabled us to improve the quality of the platform and the integrity of what we're developing. And it provides validation when you have more customers that are buying the materials and accessing the platform. And all of that has served to be a really virtuous circle that allows us to then deliver on sort of the promise that we talk about, which is three things. One, that we can deliver materials and ingredients that are at the right price. Second, that they deliver discernible performance advantages. And third, that it's more sustainable than incumbent alternatives, that it's allowing us and importantly, allowing our customers and partners to achieve, their targets, their goals around decarbonization.
Yeah, no, great. Moving on, I just wanted to get a sense, when you think about some of the comms challenges, right, that the climate and the ag tech industry face as a whole and how they're evolving, what kind of comes to mind for you guys, as it were?
I would say cost down. I think that in the ag tech space in particular, but also material science and others, anytime a startup has a brilliant technology that uses a small fraction of the land, water, and energy of the incumbent, the problem is that that startup is brand new. They have to hire a lot more biochemists or scientists than normal. They haven't even started manufacturing operations. There's going to be an enormous, valley of death that you have to cross to scale up. And therefore, you have a much higher cost than the incumbent product. And I just really believe that if you're asking consumers, especially mass market consumers, to accept a green premium, right, just for sustainability, you lose every single time. And this is where too many companies are right now in this space. Too many well-intentioned, awesome technology-enabled companies are trying to sell a product that is double, triple the cost of organic, you know, pick your poison, right? Lamb meat, bison meat, beef, fish, etc. And there's just a very, very small pool of consumers who are willing to pay that green premium. Again, I learned this lesson. Elon learned this lesson the hard way with Tesla. When we had a $150,000 electric sports car, we only sold about 1,800, 2,000 of those cars. That is the total global market for an awesome electric vehicle that you can charge with your solar panels at $150,000. We sold it to every single person who would buy one, right? And that's it. And you see the same thing, although at lower price points, with a Impossible Burger that costs $6, $8, $10 a pound, right? If you can't compete against $2 a pound for ground beef, you effectively will always be a niche. And it doesn't matter how many advertisements you use, how much awareness you have. If you have that big of a delta between your product's cost and the incumbent cost, then you're screwed, honestly. And I really, really encourage startups to drive down that cost curve, because that you cannot survive the current sort of winter in Silicon Valley where no one is investing, right? And consumers can't afford, don't want to pay that much of a premium for being green. You can't put that burden on consumers. It's the most important issue facing food tech, but also all of the sort of mission-driven startups.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll add a little bit of another problem, I think, is specifically in food, maybe less so in energy and electrics. The level of awareness of the problem we're solving is very low, right? So like, the classic Silicon Valley saying is, make sure you're solving a problem somebody has. And the issue we have with comms is we're solving a problem people don't know they have. So we all know from science and numbers and statistics, the problem is very real in food and we need to improve the sustainability. But when you look at general population, the awareness is actually not nearly as high, right? Even in the most pressing of categories as beef, the recent poll by Washington Post, like 75% of people don't even realize the food and climate are connected, right? And you're operating in an environment of a high amount of greenwash coming from the beef industry, where random shoppers you would pull at a store would say, oh, grass-fed is great, like it's actually very sustainable and fantastic, right? Or organic solves all the problems, or local is a way to go. And in you come with your alternative, but if the people are not seeking an alternative to the incumbent, then what are you solving, right? And then on top of it, as Rachel said, then you're also asking them to pay a premium. So it shrinks your market even further, that not only are you only preaching to those who are willing to pay, but you're preaching to the converted, and the converted a few, right? And so I feel like that's another hurdle that in food and alternative kind of protein environment, we are yet to cross that hurdle to actually create a market where there's a need that's articulated by end consumers. So that's almost like a collective, I don't want to say education, but kind of a collective awareness building we need to do to create the space for where our companies can then exist.
Yeah, absolutely. There's certainly a really polarized debate out there, isn't there, between alternative protein and meat eaters. It's a political debate. How does that conversation move on from here? It seems to be a little bit stuck. Lots of climate, lots of communications about the issues and the challenges out there, right? Some of it isn't landing, right? There's disinformation out there. There's many different channels. What is the best route forward? You guys are very passionate around this. How do you see this path forward?
Rachel, you lived that world with Impossible. You take it.
Yeah, so I would just say that there is no debate, Simon. There is a massive, unlimited funded, bullshitting greenwashing campaign going on the part of the U.S. Cattlemen's Association and Big Beef, right? Let's really call that out. There is no debate. There's no debate on climate change, right? And the rising sea levels and the rising temperatures of our Earth, right? there is greenwashing. And I think that is incumbent on, alt meat and startups that are providing an alternative to take that battle head on. And I just see too many startups, frankly, that are like, no, we're just going to tell our own positive story, and it's like, you can't, it's not a level playing field, right? This is the awesome challenge of working at a startup, is like, you're super cash strapped, you have all these challenges around technology and cost down, and you are presenting, if your technology is truly disruptive, an existential threat to the incumbent industry. And man, if you are an existential threat, they will do whatever it takes to eliminate you. And in the case of, the animal ag sector, the slaughter industry, as I like to call it, they will do whatever it takes to cut you down. This is why, Pat Brown, the founder of Impossible Foods, has had death threats, and I was, doxxed and stuff like that. Like it is incumbent on the startups to fight the incumbent bullshit. And that means calling it out every step of the way. You cannot let their, disinformation campaign about, regenerative ag and happy cows live in California. You cannot let that stuff slide, because once it's implanted in consumers' brains, it takes a long time to unwind that. Plus, again, then you're dealing with a premium product that you're asking people to pay extra money for, right? So you really need to attack it every single time this disinformation comes up, right? Famously in 2020, the beef sector, created a Super Bowl ad through their disinformation and propaganda agency called Center for Consumer Freedom. And they ran the Super Bowl ad in limited geographies. And we at Impossible Foods created, the antithesis of that, right? Like, let's call bullshit on Big Beef's bullshit, right? And so we ran that. But then, by the way, the Big Beef sector ran their ad for literally years on Fox Business and elsewhere, and it was combined with advertorial. It was combined with massive social media blitz, etc. And that has a real impact. And I really wish the startups would be much more aggressive in battling that. Again, too often they fall back on this sort of classic incumbent big company marketing trope, which is like, no, we're just telling our own positive story. It's like, well, then you're dead.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Yeah, that's why, I mean, that's been my strategy. If you follow me, we beat that drum real hard. But I would say that yes to everything you're saying, but we're kind of in this David versus Goliath fight, right? As Rachel's saying, like the incumbent industry we're massively outgunned by a factor of 1,000, right? And so the way I like to think about it is how do we amplify? How do we get the right friends in the ring to help us with our message, right? So the good news, we do have the facts on our side, but so did the climate movement. And if you look at the history and how long, it's been decades, right, of climate scientists chipping away with facts at the propaganda machine, and we're 40 years in and we still have a third of the population that doesn't think climate change is real, right, despite the fact that they're getting pummeled by hurricanes and wildfires. And so to me, the question is, yes to everything you're saying, the startups need to take the flag and carry it up the hill, but also how do we get the right parties in the room to help us, to amplify the message, to bust the myths? How do we get media spooled up and the editors of magazines fact checking the stories that come out, right? How do we educate some of the scientists who know the facts but maybe are not great at communications? How do we help them? How do we get NGOs to be on our side? How do we engage with some regulators and politicians to help level the playing field, to not allow this nomenclature nonsense go on, right, about milk only comes from hoofed cows? And it's multi-layer game, and it's really, really hard for one startup to kind of try to play across. But I think that's what's truly required if we're going to accelerate and actually get end consumers to see the reality and the facts, because without it, I agree with Rachel. Like, we're dead. We're not just going to be like, oh, buy this or that or me. Like, I'm nice. Like, nobody cares. Nobody cares.
I'll throw in an optimistic view, which is that I think that this is in flight, and let me explain what I mean by that. And in explaining it, I think it's important to highlight a bit of a paradox that all startups face in the world of materials, ingredients, foods, because on the one hand, to really move the needle and to have the credibility, whether it's with, policymakers or whether it's with incumbents and stakeholders, you have to have scale. You have to have something that can, impact millions, if not billions of people. Yet the reality, that the paradox lies in, you can't build scale overnight. Maybe you can do that in information technology. In fact, you can do that in information technology. We've seen that done. But when it comes to things with supply chains and moving goods and cost structure, some of the themes that we've been talking about, that doesn't happen overnight. And so what can be done, and if you look at the history of, say, the petrochemicals industry or the oleochemicals industry, every commodity product started as a specialty product. But the paradox lies in when you come to market with something, whether it's, the $150,000 Roadster and it's a really discrete small market, the cynics will point to that and say, it's not relevant, it's too small, it's niche, it's cute, it's a hobby, and they won't take it seriously. But that's where the optimism comes in, because I think that that's a mistake. I think that you have to take that seriously, because I think Tesla is a great example of how, when you continue to lower the cost structure and as you continue to penetrate the market, that can be a real catalyst to drive broader adoption. I don't think it's a coincidence or it's a mistake that, General Motors and Ford and the top automakers today have really thrown in a meaningful way around electric vehicles. And I think the same is true in what we're seeing in the context of oils and triglycerides, that as we've demonstrated the business model, the ability to generate gross margin and the ability to grow and to scale and to get into adjacent applications, that's the force for good. That's the catalyst. And I think over time, we'll see more and more use cases that bring this to life. And for better or worse, we are in a climate crisis. The world needs this. You have major petrochemical companies that are acknowledging anthropogenic climate change. Like, we know where the world has to go. The struggle is people want certainty. People want scale. And that's the part that I think is well in flight in demonstrating. And we can take inspiration from certain markets that have really brought that to life.
Can I just mention one thing too? I mean, the only way that I really am a skeptic around industry consortia and stuff like that. I don't see that that's going to work. I don't even know if awareness building in the public and in the media is going to work. I think the only thing that's going to work is having a vastly better product than the incumbent product at the same price as the incumbent industry standard, right? You cannot convince me that anybody would buy a Tesla today if it didn't have a better 0 to 60 acceleration, if it weren't the safest car that NHTSA has ever crash tested, if it didn't look great, if it didn't have an awesome user interface, if it didn't have a better stereo system, etc. People will not buy that car only because they can charge it from their solar panels. It is only because it is a vastly better car than anything even vaguely at its price point. And we need to acknowledge in the food sector that we are not there yet. I mean, I am obviously like a huge passionate advocate for deleting beef from your diet. But let's be really clear that I don't even think the Impossible Burger, which is by far the best product on the market, amongst the startups, is there, right? And so this is again why it's so awesome and challenging and fun to work at startups, is that you have to make at least a better product, right? A little bit better in all of the things that consumers care about: taste, nutrition, sustainability, etc. And you need it to do it at the same price point as the incumbents that have spent trillions of dollars in the case of animal ag on owning the slaughterhouses and the ranch land and the pasture land and the distribution channels. And until you get there, it really doesn't matter how many ads you do, how many industry consortium you join, all that kind of stuff. The product is not there yet. But to Charlie's point, it's getting there. We can easily see that this is happening already. And so I too I'm super optimistic, but we're just not there yet.
Yeah, it's great. And look, on that note, I think we're leaving on a very optimistic note, right? So just wanted to say, guys, thanks very much. It's been a great conversation. We could speak for hours about this, but Charlie, Irina, Rachel, really appreciate your time today. It's been great having you on. Thanks a lot, and look forward to catching up soon.
Super fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All the best. Take care. Bye-bye.